There's a generation of people who remember what boredom actually felt like. Not the restless scrolling kind of boredom where you're technically doing something but nothing feels satisfying. Real boredom. The kind where you'd sit and stare at a wall, where time moved slowly, where you had to actually create something out of nothing to entertain yourself. These people grew up without smartphones, without streaming services, without the internet in their pocket. And the psychological differences between them and those who've never known that kind of existence are profound and measurable. People who grew up without constant entertainment developed a completely different relationship with their own minds. They learned to be alone with their thoughts because there was no alternative. There were hours, sometimes entire days, where external stimulation simply wasn't available. You'd finish your homework, there was nothing on the 3 television channels, your friends weren't available, and you'd just sit there. In those moments, something important happened psychologically. The brain learned to generate its own content. It learned to daydream, to imagine, to process experiences, to create internal narratives. This capacity for internal generation is one of the most significant psychological differences. Modern research in neuroscience shows that the brain's default mode network, the system that activates when we're not focused on external tasks, is crucial for creativity, self-reflection, memory consolidation, and emotional processing. This network needs idle time to function properly. It needs boredom. People who grew up without constant entertainment had no choice but to give their brains this idle time regularly. Their default mode networks developed fully and naturally because they spent significant portions of their childhood and adolescence in states of understimulation. The psychological result is a different baseline level of comfort with silence and stillness. These individuals can sit in a waiting room without immediately reaching for their phone. They can take a walk without listening to a podcast. They can eat a meal alone without needing to watch something. This isn't moral superiority, it's neurological conditioning. Their brains learned early that understimulation is tolerable, even productive. They developed what psychologists call distress tolerance for boredom. The discomfort of having nothing to do doesn't trigger the same urgent need for stimulation that it does in people who've never had to sit with that feeling for extended periods. This tolerance for boredom connects directly to attention span and the ability to engage in deep work. People who grew up without constant entertainment learned to sustain attention on single tasks for extended periods because that was the only way to accomplish anything or experience anything engaging. Reading a book meant actually reading for hours without interruption. Playing meant sustained imaginative engagement with limited toys or resources. Even watching television required commitment because you couldn't pause, rewind, or switch between options endlessly. You watched what was on, or you didn't watch at all. The psychological effect of this sustained attention practice is significant. Attention is like a muscle that develops through use. People who spent their formative years regularly engaging in sustained single-focus activities developed stronger attentional control. They can more easily resist distraction, maintain focus on difficult tasks, and push through the discomfort of sustained mental effort. This shows up in their adult lives, in their ability to read long-form content, work on complex problems without constant task switching, and engage deeply with challenging material. There's also a fundamental difference in how these individuals relate to delayed gratification. Growing up without constant entertainment meant waiting was unavoidable. You wanted to watch a specific show. You waited until it aired at its scheduled time. You wanted to know something. You waited until you could get to a library or ask someone who knew. You wanted to communicate with a friend. You waited until you could see them or call them at home. Waiting wasn't optional. It was simply how everything worked. This created thousands of repetitions of the psychological experience of wanting something and having to tolerate the gap between desire and fulfillment. The famous marshmallow test in psychology showed that children who could delay gratification had better life outcomes decades later. People who grew up without constant entertainment were essentially doing marshmallow tests constantly. They were building the psychological infrastructure for impulse control and delayed gratification through sheer repetition. Modern research shows this capacity is partially neurological, involving prefrontal cortex development and executive function. But it's also learned through experience. The brain that regularly practices waiting develops better waiting capacity. This manifests in adult behavior in multiple ways. These individuals are often better at long-term planning and goal pursuit because they're psychologically equipped to tolerate the gap between action and reward. They're more likely to complete degree programs, save money, maintain difficult exercise routines, and pursue goals that require sustained effort over months or years. Not because they're morally superior or more disciplined, but because their brains learned early that rewards often come after significant waiting and that waiting is manageable. Another crucial psychological difference is in the realm of creativity and resourcefulness. When entertainment options were limited, people had to create their own. You'd make up games with whatever was available. You'd build things out of random materials. You'd create elaborate imaginary worlds with minimal props. You'd figure out how to entertain yourself and others, using only imagination and whatever physical resources existed in your immediate environment. This was creative problem-solving under constraint, repeated thousands of times throughout childhood. Psychological research shows that constraints actually enhance creativity rather than limiting it. The brain becomes more creative when it has to work within boundaries than when it has unlimited options. People who grew up without constant entertainment were constantly working within severe entertainment constraints, which meant they were constantly exercising creative muscles. They learned that entertainment doesn't come from external sources. It comes from what you do with whatever is available. This internalized locus of entertainment creates adults who are less dependent on external stimulation and more capable of generating engagement from minimal inputs. This creative self-sufficiency extends into problem-solving more broadly. These individuals tend to approach problems with a figure-it-out mentality, rather than immediately looking for external solutions or answers. If something broke, you tried to fix it yourself. If you didn't know something, you thought about it, asked around, or worked it out logically. The immediate availability of answers via search engines didn't exist, so the habit of sustained thinking about problems developed by default. The psychological result is greater comfort with uncertainty and greater confidence in one's own cognitive resources. There's also a significant difference in social skill development. Without constant entertainment mediation, social interaction was the primary source of engagement. You spent hours with friends doing relatively nothing, which meant you had to learn to navigate conversation, conflict, boredom together, and unstructured social time. You couldn't retreat into your phone when interactions got awkward or difficult. You had to develop the skills to maintain connection through boring moments, to create entertainment together, to resolve conflicts face-to-face because there was no way to avoid someone you'd just argued with. This forced development of social navigation skills created adults with different interpersonal capabilities. They're often better at reading nonverbal cues because they had to rely on those cues exclusively without the cushion of text communication. They're more comfortable with silence in conversations because silence was a normal part of interaction. They're better at conflict resolution because they couldn't ghost people or avoid difficult conversations through digital means. They had to learn to be socially competent because there was no technological mediation to smooth over social friction. The relationship with solitude is also fundamentally different. People who grew up without constant entertainment learned that being alone doesn't mean being lonely. They spent significant time by themselves without external stimulation, and they survived it. They learned that their own company can be pleasant, that internal thought can be engaging, that solitude offers specific psychological benefits that social time doesn't provide. This creates adults who need less external validation, who are more comfortable with independence, and who don't experience the same anxiety around being alone that characterizes many people who've never learned to be comfortable with just themselves. Modern psychology research on solitude shows it's essential for self-reflection, identity development, emotional regulation, and creativity. But solitude only provides these benefits if you can actually be alone with your thoughts, rather than filling every moment with external content. People who grew up without constant entertainment had no choice but to develop this capacity. They learned early that time alone with your thoughts isn't something to be frantically avoided. It's just normal existence, And sometimes it's even preferable to social stimulation. There's also a difference in how these individuals experience and process emotion. Without constant distraction available, emotional experiences couldn't be immediately avoided or numbed. If you were sad, you sat with sadness. If you were anxious, you experienced anxiety without immediate escape into digital distraction. This wasn't pleasant, but it was psychologically developmental. The brain learned that difficult emotions are survivable, that they pass naturally without requiring immediate intervention, and that sitting with discomfort doesn't destroy you. This emotional tolerance shows up in adult life as better emotional regulation and less anxiety around negative feelings. These individuals are often more accepting of their emotional states, less reactive to emotional discomfort, and better at allowing feelings to naturally process rather than immediately trying to fix or escape them. They learned through experience that emotions are temporary, that you can feel bad without it being an emergency, and that distraction isn't necessary for emotional survival. The relationship with information and learning is also distinct. Growing up without constant access to information meant that knowledge was valuable and worth retaining. You couldn't just look everything up instantly, so if you learned something, you actually remembered it. You developed better memory systems because memory was functionally necessary. You also developed appreciation for expertise because access to people who knew things was valuable. You couldn't just Google answers, so finding someone who actually understood a topic was genuinely useful. This created different learning psychology. These individuals often have better retention because they trained their memories rather than offloading everything to external storage. They're more likely to deeply learn things rather than shallowly accessing information because deep learning was more efficient than repeatedly looking things up. They have different relationships with experts and teachers because they experience the genuine value of knowledge transfer in a way that's less obvious when all information feels equally available. The patience for process is another significant difference. Everything took longer without modern technology. Communication took longer. Getting information took longer. Entertainment required setup and commitment. Travel took longer. Projects took longer. This constant experience of processes taking time created psychological acceptance that worthwhile things often require significant time investment. These individuals are more likely to stick with difficult learning curves, to persist through slow phases of projects, and to maintain engagement even when progress is gradual. Modern instant gratification culture creates psychological expectation that everything should happen immediately. When it doesn't, frustration and abandonment follow quickly. People who grew up without constant entertainment never developed that expectation. Their baseline expectation is that things take time, effort, and patience. This makes them psychologically better equipped for actually difficult pursuits that require sustained effort over extended periods. There's also a difference in relationship with physical space and physical activity. Without digital entertainment constantly available, physical space and physical activity were primary sources of engagement. You'd explore your neighborhood thoroughly because there was nothing else to do. You'd play outside for hours because outside was more interesting than inside. You'd engage in physical games and activities because physical activity was how you entertained yourself. This created strong associations between physical activity and satisfaction, between exploration and engagement, between movement and well-being. The psychological result is adults who are more likely to naturally engage in physical activity, who find satisfaction in physical movement, who explore their environments actively rather than digitally, and who have better integrated mind-body awareness. They learned early that bodies are sources of engagement and pleasure, not just vehicles for brains consuming digital content. This shows up in better physical health outcomes, more active lifestyles, and greater comfort with physicality. The experience of true boredom also taught important lessons about desire and satisfaction. When entertainment was scarce, the entertainment that existed was deeply satisfying. Getting to watch your favorite show was genuinely exciting because it was rare. Getting a new book was an event because books were limited. Playing with friends was precious because you couldn't do it constantly. Scarcity created value, and value created satisfaction. These individuals learned that constraint enhances appreciation and that unlimited access diminishes value. This psychology directly contradicts modern abundance culture, where everything is always available. These individuals often find more satisfaction in limited engagement with entertainment than in unlimited consumption, because their brains learned early that scarcity enhances value. They're less susceptible to the hedonic treadmill of constantly seeking more stimulation. Because they experience that constraint and scarcity actually create deeper satisfaction than abundance. There's also a completely different relationship with failure and frustration. When you were building something, playing a difficult game, or trying to figure something out without instant answers, you failed repeatedly. You experienced frustration, had to tolerate it, had to persist through it, and eventually either succeeded or accepted failure. This repetition of the frustration-persistence cycle built psychological resilience. These individuals learned that frustration is a normal part of engagement, that failure is part of process, and that pushing through difficulty often leads to eventual success. Modern instant gratification culture allows people to avoid frustration immediately by switching to something easier. This prevents the development of frustration tolerance. People who grew up without constant entertainment didn't have that escape option, so they built frustration tolerance through forced repetition. This shows up in adult life as greater persistence, better coping with setbacks, and more realistic expectations about how difficult things actually are. The identity development process was also different. Without constant external input about who you should be, what you should like, and how you should present yourself, these individuals had more space to discover their actual preferences and identity. You couldn't curate a digital persona. You had to be yourself in physical space with the people around you. You discovered what you actually enjoyed by trying things and seeing what held your attention, not by consuming endless content about what others enjoyed. This created more authentic identity development. These individuals often have clearer sense of their actual preferences, stronger internal sense of self, and less dependence on external validation for identity coherence. They learned who they were through direct experience and self-reflection, rather than through social media feedback loops and algorithmic content curation. Finally, there's a fundamental difference in the perception of time itself. Without constant stimulation compressing attention into brief bursts, time felt longer and more spacious. Childhood summers felt endless, afternoons stretched out with possibility. Time had texture and depth because attention wasn't constantly fragmented. This created psychological experience of time as abundant rather than scarce, of life as spacious rather than compressed. Modern research shows that constant task switching and digital stimulation creates perception of time passing more quickly and life feeling shorter. People who grew up without constant entertainment have different temporal psychology. They experienced time as slow and abundant in childhood, which created different relationship with time in adulthood. They're more comfortable with slow processes, more patient with time-consuming activities, and less anxious about time scarcity because their baseline experience of time is fundamentally different. None of this means growing up without constant entertainment was objectively better, or that modern technology is purely negative. These are simply observable psychological differences that emerge from radically different childhood environments. Understanding these differences matters because it reveals what's being lost in current developmental environments and what specific capacities need to be intentionally cultivated when they're no longer developing naturally through environmental constraint. The people who grew up without constant entertainment aren't superhuman. They're simply the product of an environment that forced certain psychological developments through constraint. Their brains learned specific capacities because those capacities were necessary for functioning in that environment. The question facing current and future generations is whether these capacities, attention span, frustration tolerance, creative self-sufficiency, comfort with solitude, emotional regulation, these can be intentionally developed in environments of abundance, or whether they require the constraint of scarcity to emerge naturally. Understanding the psychology of those who had no choice but to develop these capacities is the first step in figuring out how to cultivate them when constant entertainment is always available, but perhaps not always beneficial.